Hi guys, it's Miss Dean here, and today I'm going to talk to you about some of the terms to know from Unit 1, particularly related to biomolecules. And here's what I want you guys to do as you watch this screencast. So you definitely should be taking notes. Basically, anything that's on the slide is good to write down in your notebook. And then I also would really encourage you guys to do some sketching and drawing and labeling. So that might take you some time. So pause the screencast if you need to take a moment to finish writing things down, and then you can start the screencast again when you're ready. All right, so here we go. We're going to be talking about what terms you need to know related to biomolecules. We've already talked about biomolecules, but we haven't really defined it. So let's do that. Biomolecules are molecules necessary for every living thing on Earth to survive. So it doesn't matter if it's a bacteria that's living in your gut, a redwood tree, an orca, any living thing on Earth needs these molecules in order to survive. Why? What do we do with those? Well, they're essential sources of energy for us. We've already been talking a little bit about how biomolecules or which biomolecules provide energy. They're a means of storing energy, and they're also instructions, particularly the nucleic acids. So that's our first term, biomolecule. There are two more broad terms that I really want you guys to know. So the first one's a monomer. A monomer is just a single unit. It's a molecule that can be combined with other molecules of the same type to form a more complex molecule. So here's our example. If you're going to draw or sketch something, this would be a glucose molecule. It's a monomer. It's a carbohydrate monomer. So you can't break it down into a smaller sugar. This is kind of the smallest form. Again, this is glucose, and it's a monomer of a carbohydrate. And then the next term is a polymer. So this is a single molecule that can be combined with other molecules of the same type, right? That forms a more complex molecule. So if you link or bond a whole bunch of glucoses together, you can get a polymer. For example, starch is a polymer. Okay, so three broad terms to know are biomolecules, monomers, and polymers. Now we're going to get into the specific four different types of biomolecules, and we're going to start with carbohydrates. So definitely you are responsible for knowing the things on this slide. We've already talked a little bit about what elements are in carbohydrates, so you guys should know it's carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in a 1-to-1 ratio. So here are some examples of carbohydrates. So monosaccharide just means single sugar. These are the monomers of carbohydrates, right? So glucose and fructose are examples of those. Disaccharide just means two sugars linked together, and I want to show you an example of what that might look like. So lactose or milk sugar is an example of a disaccharide. Sucrose, which is table sugar, is another example of a disaccharide. And if you wanted to draw it, you would draw a glucose molecule linked to a fructose molecule. That's table sugar, essentially. That is sucrose. And then we've got polysaccharides, so many saccharides, many sugars. And you should be familiar with three different types of polysaccharides. So the first is starch. Starches are energy storage for plants. Glycogen, which is energy storage for us, animals. That's how we store excess carbohydrates. And then cellulose. Cellulose is structural support for plants, essentially. So what's the function of carbohydrates? It's the primary source of energy for us. Particularly, your cells use glucose for energy. So primary energy source. It's a really important function for carbohydrates. And then I mentioned earlier, it's structural support in the cell walls of plants. So cellulose can be found inside of the cell walls of different plants. This is just a picture to show you what these different polysaccharides look like. They're very similar in structure, actually. So here's some potatoes. If you looked inside of a cell of a potato, you'd see starch granules, right? And the starch granules are really just a long polysaccharide, a long chain of glucose monomers linked together. If you looked inside of a muscle cell in a human, what you might see is glycogen, right? So here are glycogen granules in muscle tissue. These are also long chains of glucose monomers strung together, but they're branched. So it's a little bit different in terms of its structure. And then if you were to look inside of a cell wall, you would find cellulose. Again, very similar in structure, long chains of glucose, but you can see they're also linked together by hydrogen bonds. So these chains are linked to other chains. All right, so are carbohydrates a good source of energy? This is the last thing if you're taking notes that you might want to write down. The answer is definitely yes. And in particular, glucose is quick energy for your cells. It's what your cells actually use for energy. And again, we'll learn more about that next week. And then starches and glycogen are short-term storage. We're going to move on to lipids now. So again, you guys probably already know this, but what elements are in lipids? It's mostly carbon and hydrogen, actually, with some oxygen. And so that's why I put the oxygen in parentheses. Okay? So lipids are comprised of carbon and hydrogen primarily, with some oxygen. This is a really diverse group of compounds. What they have in common is they have hydrophobic properties, meaning that they don't mix well with water. Hydro means water, phobic means fearing, right? And why? Why is that? It's because they have these long fatty acid chains in their structure. I'm going to move myself here so you can see. So here's some examples of lipids. Oils and fats. These are made of a glycerol. I always think of it like a head. I think of these like jellyfish. And then fatty acid chains. So fatty acids are just carbon and hydrogen chains. Okay. Those are in animal and plant cells for long-term storage. Phospholipids are a little bit different in terms of their structure. They've also got a glycerol head, but they've got a phosphate group there too. So here's actually a picture of a phospholipid, and you can see the two fatty acids, kind of like the tails, right? What are phospholipids? This is what your membranes of every single cell are made of. So your cell membranes and every cell membrane of all cells, organisms living on Earth, are made of phospholipids. And the phospholipid membrane helps to regulate really what can come in and out of your cells. Another example of lipids are steroids. Cholesterol is an example. Sex hormones are an example of steroids. And these are different in structure. They've got a carbon skeleton with 4 fused rings. Okay, so here's examples of lipids. What do they do? Well, these are, for you, really long-term energy storage. But they also make up the membranes of your cells, like I mentioned. Okay, so lipids, are they a good source of energy? Yes, they are. Again, they're long-term energy storage. They can hold more energy than a carbohydrate can per gram. So it's more compact energy, essentially. We're going to spend time in other units talking about proteins and nucleic acids. So I'm going to go through these quickly and let you know sort of basically what you need to know now. But again, we're going to come back to these biomolecules later in the year. You do need to know what elements are in a protein. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But then, as you guys already figured out, there's also nitrogen in proteins and some sulfur, which again is why it's in parentheses. You need to know that the basic building block of all proteins, the monomers of proteins, are called amino acids. And if you string a chain of amino acids together, you basically get a protein, which is also called a polypeptide. And you can see that in the image here. So polypeptides are chains of amino acids. Proteins really do everything, or so much of what goes on in our bodies. There's so many different functions. I'm just giving you a couple of examples here. So they provide structure. Our hair is made of proteins. Tendons and ligaments are made of proteins. They provide transport functions. So an example is hemoglobin in your red blood cells. That's a protein that carries oxygen to the rest of your body. And another really important function of proteins is that many of them are enzymes that help to speed up chemical reactions in your body. So imagine if you eat or drink milk. Milk contains a disaccharide called lactose. If you have lactase, which is an enzyme, right, it actually can help to speed up and break down the lactose, the milk sugar. Adults sometimes don't make lactase anymore, and if you don't, then you're lactose intolerant. All right, so those are the functions of proteins. Are they a good source of energy? The answer is only if needed. Really, lipids and carbohydrates are your main sources of energy. Your body is not going to use proteins unless it really needs to. And finally, we're going to talk about nucleic acids. So, do you eat nucleic acids? Well, sure, because nucleic acids are in every cell in the form of either DNA or RNA. So if we're talking about eukaryotic cells, cells that are not bacteria, essentially, you'll find DNA in the nucleus of cells, but it can also be found in the chloroplasts of plants and the mitochondria of plants and animals. What elements are in nucleic acids? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Here's what you need to know really basically for nucleic acids. You do need to know that the monomers are called nucleotides. And if you string a bunch of nucleotides together, you're going to get a nucleic acid. That's the polymer. And the example of those are RNA and DNA. The function of nucleic acids is to provide genetic instructions, basically to program all of your cell's activities. And finally, are nucleic acids a good source of energy? And the answer is no. So this is just a primer for what we're going to talk about next time. Most of what you eat, your proteins, your lipids, your carbohydrates, right? When you eat them, they must be broken down into smaller molecules before your cells can use them. All right, so if you're eating polymers, those polymers are getting broken down into monomers, and some of those monomers might go for your cells to use them as a source of energy, or your cell can recycle those monomers and use them as building blocks for whatever your cells need. Okay, so to wrap things up, let's go back to the question that we talked about at the beginning of this unit. So if you were running a marathon tomorrow, what would you want to eat tonight and why? I'm giving you some different choices this time though. So would you want to eat primarily polysaccharides like starches, baked potatoes, pastas, things like that? Would you want to eat a lot of simple sugars like fruit and sugary drinks? Would you want to have mostly proteins like meatballs, chicken, and fish, or beans? Or would you want to eat mostly lipids, olives, avocados, and nuts? So hopefully you have the information that you need now to figure out what you should be eating when you need sustained energy for something like a marathon. And that's it for the screencast. I'll see you guys tomorrow.